break Pokemon were pretty unpopular upon their release despite being a pretty interesting mechanic. We'd not seen this type of Pokemon card since the Level X Pokemon, so today I'm going to be talking about every break card ever created, starting with the break cards found in X and Y Breakthrough. Like Chestnut, the break Pokemon cards were a bit difficult to follow during play. They would be placed horizontally over the top of a pre-existing card. This would essentially give your Pokemon more HP as well as another attack which could turn the tide in the battle. For example, this Chestnut break card would be placed on top of this Chestnut card. This would then give Chestnut 3 attacks as well as 30 extra HP. The Chestnut break card had the Tough Hammer attack which would do 160 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon as well as 30 damage to a benched Pokemon, with the drawback of also doing 30 damage of recoil. You could even have combined this with the X and Y base set Chestnut 2 which had the Spiky Shield ability, which would allow Chestnut to do some pretty big damage as well as heal 20 damage with its touchdown attack. Nowadays this Chestnut break card sells for $3. Up next we have the Raichu break card. Much like Chestnut from earlier, this Raichu break card could go on top of this regular Raichu card. However, there were actually 3 more cards you could have put this Raichu break card on top of, so you had a lot of different options with the Raichu break. This is what I always personally really liked about these break cards. They worked with any Pokemon that was the same. Raichu break had the Ground Bolt attack which could do a huge 170 damage with the drawback of discarding 3 energy from this Pokemon, which isn't ideal, but you get what you put in. This Raichu break card sells today for $8. And then we have yet another Generation 1 Pokemon with the Marowak break card, which was really fun. Marowak break can be placed on 2 other Marowak cards. However, I personally think that this one would have been the best option. Found within Fates Collide, this Marowak has the Bodyguard ability, which would block all attack effects done to you or your hand by your opponent's attacks. This made it a really good blocking option even without the break Marowak. However, Bone Revenge would be a huge improvement. Giving Marowak the ability to do 20 damage plus 40 for each prize card your opponent had taken was not bad at all. So if your opponent had taken 3 prize cards, then Marowak could do 140 damage. The Marowak break card sells today for $4. And then we have Zoroark break, one of the best break cards we're going to talk about today. Break cards could get pretty complicated. If they added an extra attack that had a lot of after effects or did some big damage, it could all just become a bit confusing. So Zoroark break had the very simple foul play attack, which would allow you to steal an attack from your opponent and use it for only 1 dark energy. Most decks would run Zoroark break with this Zoroark card due to its standing ability. If you paired this up with the Zoroark GX found in Shining Legends, then you would begin to have a pretty powerful deck including this break card. Nowadays the break card sells for $5. Then we have Florges break, which is our first break card that would add an ability to your Pokemon. Florges break's ability is called Floral Breeze, and you would be able to heal 30 damage from your active Pokemon as well as removing any status effects from this Pokemon too. If you combine that with the Flash Fire Florges, then you could do 20 damage to all Pokemon every turn. Combined with the HP of break Florges, that's not bad at all. Nowadays the break Florges sells for $3. And for our final break Pokemon from Breakthrough, we have the Noivern break card. Noivern break has the Synchro Woofer attack, which would do 150 damage provided you and your opponent had the same number of cards in hand. If you didn't, it would do 70 damage. This is of course an awful break attack that is way too dependent on what your opponent does. It takes a lot of the control away from your deck and hand and becomes too reliant on your opponents. You could have in theory used this break card on this Noivern from Furious Fist, but honestly this break card is so bad it really isn't even worth trying to use. The Noivern break card sells today for $3. And so we have our first few promotional cards for the video, starting with Empoleon break. This Empoleon break card had the Emperor's Command attack. This attack would do 30 damage for each of your opponent's Pokemon in play for a max of 150 damage. Now you could however use this Empoleon as more of a HP wall. If you put Empoleon break on top of this Empoleon from Breakthrough, then you could use the Dignified Fighter ability for longer before your Empoleon was taken out, thanks to Empoleon break and its 170 HP. The Empoleon break card sells today for $15, which brings us to the Behem break card. The Behem break had the attack Cosmic Circle, which would do 100 damage for free psychic energy and allow you to shuffle your energy around as you please. This kind of makes sense, but you would be better off attaching the energy directly throughout your bench as opposed to putting it all onto Behem just to then move the energy around, especially for only 100 damage. Now that is a decent amount of damage, but the effect just makes it not really worthwhile. You could have put this Behem break onto this Behem from Breakthrough, but that was really the only option available to you. Behem break sells today for $9. And for our final promo card released to coincide with Breakthrough, we have the Noctowl break. Noctowl break actually had some utility going for it thanks to Night Scan. Noctowl break would do 60 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. From there, your opponent would reveal their hand, and if they were stacking trainer cards in hand, this attack would do 30 more damage. So if they had 3 trainer cards in hand, this attack would do 150 damage in total. Again, though, like a lot of cards we have spoken about already, this is a bit too dependent on what your opponent is doing and stacking. Noctowl break never saw any play because there weren't really any good Noctowl cards to pair with it, hence why it was a promotional release. Noctowl break sells today for $8. Then we have Break Point, our second set for the break card cards, and this one has some really good break cards within it, starting with Golduck. Much like Florges Break from earlier, the Golduck break card has the Hyper Transfer ability, which would let you move an energy from one Pokemon to another, and that's it. This Pokemon just wasn't that good, and much like Noctowl from earlier, there was not really anything you could use this Pokemon with, so it got left behind like many break cards. The Golduck break sells today for $5. But don't worry, there is a Water-type break card within this set that saves the entire set and almost the entire break series, the Greninja break card. This card was a very viable option within the TCG. You would combine the break Greninja with this Greninja card. For a while, this was a very powerful deck in the TCG. You would use Greninja break's ability first, Giant Water Shuriken, to discard a water energy and do 6 damage to your opponent's Pokemon. Then you would use Shadow Stitching from regular Greninja or even Moonlight Slash to top up the damage to do over 100 damage. This, much like Zoroark, is one of very few examples of these cards being relevant in the meta. The break Greninja sells today for $13. Unfortunately though, meta-relevant break cards aren't going to be doing so hot throughout this video, as up next we have the Luxray break card. The Luxray break card had the Wild Fury attack, which would do 130 damage plus 40 damage per coin flip without flipping a tails. If you flip 2 heads after using this attack, you could do 210 damage, which is great. But once again, the issue with this break card is that it needed a good base Luxray for it, which just didn't exist. It's not worth investing into a break card that goes on top of a stage 2 Pokemon if the stage 2 Pokemon it's going on top of is not good. The break Luxray sells today for $6. However, with Trevenant Break, we are once again heading back to a semi-relevant meta deck. This is the Trevenant Break card. It looks pretty normal, right? Its Silent Fear attack would do 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon, and with 160 HP, you could definitely do this for a couple of turns. So how did it become so good? Well, it worked really well with this Tapu Lele promotional card, as well as cards like Ditto, Wobbuffet, and Espeon EX. It was just a really good stall option that could also pick up quite a few KOs in the process. On top of that, the Trevenant from X and Y base also had the Forest Curse ability, which would block your opponent from playing any item cards, as well as Tree Slam, which would do 60 damage plus 20 damage to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. By mixing between Silent Fear on Trevenant Break and Tree Slam with regular Trevenant, you could quickly get some KOs while also disrupting your opponent. Nowadays, the Trevenant Break sells for $3. And so we finish Breakpoint with Raticate Break. This might be the worst break card out there. Super Fang looks like a great attacking option. You could delete your opponent's HP until they had only 10 HP remaining. This isn't a bad thing. The problem was there wasn't a good Pokemon to combine this with until the release of XY Evolutions with this Raticate. But at that point, it was too late and people were already using different decks. The Raticate Break card sells today for $4. And so we are in Fates Collide, where we are starting with the Delphox Break Pokemon. Once again, this Delphox Break card just simply wasn't worth ever using. It had an ability as opposed to an attack. Flare Witch would allow you to attach 1 fire energy to your Pokemon while shuffling your deck. And that is it. There were no damage counters, no extra benefit, nothing really. Delphox had no cards that were particularly relevant in the meta at this point, and so this break card just had no purpose existing. You could have run this with the Delphox from X and Y base with the Mystical Fire ability. However, this would also negate any need for the Flare Witch ability, as you could just draw a fire energy instead. This Delphox card just doesn't really work that well. The Delphox break card sells today for $3. Omastar Break also suffers for the same reason as so many of the break Pokemon we have just covered. Omastar Break had the ability Dangerous Tentacle, which would allow you to swap your opponent's benched Pokemon with their active. It only worked with EX Pokemon, so you couldn't even bring a Pokemon in with little HP to get a guaranteed knockout. This ability was really restrictive and couldn't even work in stall decks or anything. The Omastar Break card sells today for $2. Carbink Break actually was a pretty relevant card within the meta for a bit, so this one will be a bit fun to talk about. Carbink Break has the Diamond Gift attack, which would do 20 damage and allow you to attach 2 fighting energies from your discard pile to your benched fighting types. There were some decks that were able to use this really well. This would work well in Buzzwole GX decks or with Zygarde and Landorus EX decks as a means of constantly shuffling energy onto these Pokemon. As a supporting break Pokemon, Carbink was an excellent option. The Carbink Break sells today for $2. And we're back to back for meta relevant decks, as up next we have the Bronzong Break. Now, Bronzong Break was not the focal point of any decks. However, Bronzong was a really good option. This is an example of a break Pokemon that was primarily carried by its previous stage being good. Bronzong Break had the Metal Rain attack, which would do 30 damage per energy discarded from this Pokemon to one of your opponent's Pokemon as many times as you like. This is a good option at picking out late KOs. This Bronzong Break sells today for $3. And our final Fates Collide card is the Lugia Break card. Much like many other cards on the list, this card never saw any competitive play. Lugia Break had the Flash of Destruction attack, which would do 150 damage with the caveat of discarding 2 energy. This isn't awful, but there weren't any Lugia decks kicking about in the meta that had room for Lugia Break. Most people instead decided to run the Lugia EX from Ancient Origins, which was just better in every way. The Lugia Break sells today for $20. And so it is back to the promotional cards cards, we go with Mandibuzz Break. This card is honestly pretty good. Mandibuzz Break had the Wings of Disaster attack, which will do 20 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon for only 1 energy. This seems like a really good option, but much like most of the cards today, there were no good Mandibuzz cards out there, so this card has fallen into obscurity. The Mandibuzz Break card sells today for $6. Wobbuffet Break would have a very small moment where it was used competitively at the Leipzig Regional. Wobbuffet Break had the right back at you attack, which will block your opponent from knocking out Wobbuffet. If they attacked Wobbuffet, then Wobbuffet would do the same damage back. This made Wobbuffet a really good wall option. It worked well in decks that included Hooper, Mewtwo, and Mew, as well as the regular Wobbuffet from Phantom Forces. Nowadays, the Wobbuffet Break sells for $7. Much like Lugia earlier, Ho-Oh Break would never see any competitive play for a pretty similar reason. The Ho-Oh cards that were legal for play just weren't that viable. Ho-Oh Break had the Shining Flame attack. This attack would do 160 damage for 5 energy with a 1-turn cooldown, which just wasn't that good. This wasn't enough to knock out most Break cards and honestly some EX cards. This Ho-Oh Break sells today for $30. Unfortunately, we're going to be entering a bit of a meta slump, as up next we have the Crobat Break card. Crobat Break had the Silent Bite attack, which would do 60 damage as well as allowing you to put your opponent under the paralysis effect. The problem is that if you chose to do this, then you would have to shuffle Crobat and all cards back into your deck. That is 4 cards needed to get this Pokemon Break back onto the field to use again. This is just an awfully designed card. The Crobat Break sells today for $10. We are once again done with the promos for Fates Collide and instead now have to talk about the Steam Siege set. And we're starting with a Break card that finished first at the World Championships in the Senior Division in 2016, Yanmega Break. Yanmega Break has the Barrier Break attack, which will do 100 damage, ignoring weakness, resistance, and anything from reducing damage. This sounds bad, but this was a colorless 3 energy attack, so it didn't matter what energy you put on Yanmega to use this, and this World Championship deck ran double colorless energy. There was also no drawback on this. This worked well inside of Vespiquen or even Shaymin EX decks as an excellent damaging option. This 2016 World Championship win is the only placement Yanmega ever had before it disappeared into obscurity. Much like Iron Thorns EX, the Yanmega Break card sells today for $2. This next Break card also appeared in the single deck that finished 8th at NAIC in 2017, Talonflame Break. Now this card really is not that good. The only reason it saw any play ever was because Talonflame was a really good option. Talonflame Break has Flare Blitz, which will do 150 damage while forcing you to discard all energy from this Pokemon. But given there were only 2 energies, that was not the end of the world. This Talonflame bizarrely placed in 8th with a Greninja Break deck, but as I said, it was more because of the regular Talonflame and its Gale Wings ability, which would allow you to immediately put it into the active spot during setup, giving you a stage 2 Pokemon on turn 1. The Talonflame Break sells today for $3. Unfortunately, our run of meta decks ends here, as up next we have Pyroar Break, which never had a placement at any major tournament. Pyroar Break has the Kaiser Tackle attack, which will do 180 damage as well as 50 damage of recoil. This doesn't sound bad, but given the card requires evolving up to Pyroar, it would likely take too much damage in the process, making it a bit of a risk to use this card. The Pyroar Break sells today for $4. I honestly think the Chloritz's Break card is one of the worst cards from the X and Y era. Lock-on sounds good in theory, forcing your opponent's Pokemon to stay in and doing a guaranteed 120 damage on top of whatever your Pokemon does the next turn sounds great. The problem is, no Chloritza card could do good damage, and they all had 2 energy retreat costs, so switching them out was also not a great option as you would lose the energy. This was an unsustainable attack that would hemorrhage energy way too quickly. This Chloritza sells for $3. But don't worry, we're going back to a somewhat meta-relevant card with the Yveltal Break card. Yveltal Break had the Baleful Knight attack, which would do 120 damage to the active Pokemon, as well as 30 damage to any benched Pokemon with damage counters on it on your opponent's side. If you combine this with Lysander, then you could shuffle some damage across multiple cards and then start spamming attacks with Yveltal Break. However, there was another way this could be used. Yveltal Break would be placed on top of the Yveltal found in Breakthrough, which had the Pitch Black Spear attack. By using Pitch Black Spear, you would do 60 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, as well as 60 to one of their benched Pokemon. Obviously, combining this with Yveltal Break would allow you to do a lot of damage to a lot of Pokemon. This Yveltal Break card sells today for $6. Xerneas Break would also have a moment in the meta thanks to its Life Stream attack. Life Stream would do 20 damage per energy attached to your opponent's Pokemon. It would take a little while for this card to really become useful, but then Tapu Lele GX would be added, which would open up the opportunity for these Xerneas found in Steam Siege. Xerneas could use Geomancy to start putting energy onto your Pokemon. This would power up Life Stream pretty quickly, turning it into a pretty meta threat. Xerneas Break was mainly also used as a HP wall. The Xerneas Break card sells today for $5. Hydreigon Break was the first Break card I ever owned, and I still own to this day. Hydreigon Break unfortunately wasn't that good of an option. Calamity Blast would discard free energy attached to Hydreigon to do 150 damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, as well as 50 damage to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This was a lot of energy for honestly not much benefit. It would take too long to set this up and you would get knocked out before you even made any real footing. The Hydreigon Break card sells today for $5. And so we are done with Steam Siege, and now we have to talk about X and Y evolutions. Starting with the only promotional break card for this set with Arcanine Break. Arcanine Break had the Turbo Flame attack, which would do 80 damage and allow you to attach 2 fire energy to your benched Pokemon. This is by no means a bad option, but it just never got used for some reason. There were just better options out there to build decks around. Arcanine Break wasn't bad, it was just outclassed by everything. The Arcanine Break card sells today for $25. Ninetales Break would also never be used competitively. Fire types just weren't that common in the X and Y era, and decks surrounding them were even less common. The Ninetales Break card has the Explosive Fireball attack, which would discard all fire energy attached to Ninetales, doing 60 damage per energy on top of a flat 10 damage. Meaning if you discarded 2 energy, then you could do 130 damage. The problem was losing that energy, which would take some time to catch back up. The Ninetales Break card sells for $4. Things don't get better for Starmie Break, as this card would also never be used competitively. This was a really tough point in time for Pokemon fans, and getting cards for use in the TCG wasn't an easy time. Cards were expensive, prices were out of control, and even finding the cards was a real challenge. The Starmie Break card has the Break Star attack, which would do 100 damage to each of your opponent's Break Pokemon. This would be great if anyone really used Break cards as primary parts of their deck. At most, you could knock out 1 Pokemon with this card per game, meaning it really wasn't worth investing energy into building a deck around. The Starmie Break sells for $2. And then we have Nidoking, and once again, there is no competitive history for this Pokemon. These evolutions Break cards really just weren't that good and really ruined the Break cards for a lot of people. The Nidoking Break had the Toxic Drill attack, which would do 120 damage as well as poisoning your opponent's active Pokemon, doing 2 damage per checkup instead of 1. This actually sounds fine, but for some reason no one really invested anything into these cards, and nowadays this Nidoking Break sells for $3. And that means finally we have the Machamp Break card. This card is really cool. I have been very critical of these cards throughout this video, but I do still love what Pokemon did with them. I understand the premise, and it is very reminiscent of level X's, but I think they just didn't do it very well. If anything though, it is better than level X cards in terms of competitive viability and simplicity, but unfortunately they were just still too much for the fans. That and the EX cards were just so much better. The Machamp Break card never saw any competitive play once again. This card had the Boomerang Lariat attack, which would do 100 damage as well as allowing you to do an extra 100 damage the next turn, doing 300 damage in 2 turns, which isn't bad. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and this Machamp Break card sells today for $3.